The acrid stench of burnt circuitry and synthetic alcohol permeated the dingy black market station. It was a place where the underworld thrived, where deals were made in dark corners, and where honor meant little. James stood his ground, his bulky black combat armor gleaming under the flickering neon lights. His presence was like a shadow in the mist, commanding attention from the shady figures lingering around the market stalls. He had dealt with worse: aliens, criminals, and mercenaries. But today, he was face to face with something far more dangerous. Traer, a gray-skinned alien merchant. Between them, a quantum phase modulator lay on the scratched metal counter, a rare technological artifact worth a fortune. The tension in the air was palpable. "Look, Krath," James growled, his thick, dark beard barely hiding his scowl. "We both know this tech is worth at least 50,000 credits. You're trying to screw me over." Traer's multifaceted eyes narrowed, his cold, gray skin rippling with amusement as he slid the modulator closer. 30,000. Final offer. James's grip tightened on the rifle slung across his chest. "I pulled this from a Class 4 restricted zone. Lost 2 good men getting it. This isn't some knockoff piece of junk." A low chuckle escaped from the alien merchant. "Perhaps we could sweeten the deal," he said, his voice grating like stone. With a press of a button, the door behind him slid open, revealing a figure that made James's breath catch. A humanoid woman stepped forward. Her violet skin shimmered under the lights, and her long white hair cascaded down her back like a river of silk. The form-fitting outfit she wore did little to hide her curves, and her eyes, silver and mesmerizing, met his with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through him. "Finest stock from the Century raids," Traer said with a smirk. "Pure Etherian, worth 20,000 alone. She's yours, plus the 30,000 credits." James's jaw clenched. The offer was beyond repugnant. He didn't deal in slaves. "I don't deal in slaves." Traer raised a hand, smirking. "Consider it a rescue," he said, shrugging with feigned innocence. "You get your credits, plus the satisfaction of freeing her. Everyone wins." The woman's eyes never left James's face. There was no fear in her gaze, no sign of submission. Instead, there was a calculating intelligence in those silver eyes that made him pause. James hesitated, his instincts warning him, but his gut told him something else. There was more to this woman than met the eye. "Fine," he said, voice low but firm. "But I want it in writing that she's free the moment the transfer is complete." Traer smiled widely, but it was a smile tinged with something darker. Of course, of course. Minutes later, the deal was done. James had agreed to rescue the woman, but the feeling in his gut told him that his life had just become significantly more complicated. As they walked away from the trading post, Cara's stride matched his perfectly. Her movements were fluid, like she was gliding through the station. Something about her, the way she held herself, made him wonder if he'd just been played. But before he could question further, she spoke. "My name is Cara," she said, her voice carrying an exotic accent that sent a shiver down his spine. "And I think I'll stay with you for now." As the Iron Spirit slid through the bustling docking bay, the hum of the engines felt strangely comforting. James had always preferred the quiet solitude of his ship, where he could avoid the noise of the galaxy's ever-spinning chaos. He usually flew solo, but today, he had an unexpected passenger. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss as Cara stepped aboard. The low, muffled sounds of the station faded behind them as the doors sealed shut. The silence of space enveloped them, and for a moment, it was just the two of them on this small ship, hurtling through the void. James led her into the ship's interior, a mix of military-grade efficiency and minimalist design. The walls were adorned with sleek, functional panels, but the atmosphere was cold. Too cold for some, too sterile for most. But it was home. The ship's interior felt almost Spartan compared to the grandeur of the royal ships she might have been accustomed to. Yet, the metallic scent of the ship's clean, efficient design seemed to catch her attention, just as much as the sheer utility of the space. There was no luxury here, just raw, functional power. "Make yourself comfortable while I get clearance to depart," James said, as he began removing his bulky combat armor, revealing the form-fitting black flight suit underneath. It did little to hide his muscular frame. Cara glanced around, her silver eyes drinking in every detail of the vessel. She raised an eyebrow and walked closer to the walls, her fingers brushing along the sleek lines of the Terran Vanguard-class corvette. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. Her voice was soft, but filled with a certain intensity. She ran her violet fingers along the ship's hull, clearly impressed by the Terran engineering. James raised an eyebrow. His curiosity piqued. "Now you know your ships, among other things," he replied with a slight smirk. Cara glanced at him, a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. "I know more than you think, James." She gave him a small, knowing smile. She seemed completely at ease, almost as if she had been in this environment her whole life. James stepped away to the cockpit to begin his pre-flight checks. Despite the usual routine, his mind kept wandering back to the mysterious woman now aboard his ship. Her calm confidence was unnerving. Slaves, even the best ones, were usually broken in spirit, submissive, or scared. But Cara? There was nothing submissive about her. When he returned to the main cabin, he found her standing by his small collection of rare books, her fingers gently turning the pages of an ancient Earth novel. The smell of real paper filled the air, a rarity in the era of digital archives. She was clearly fascinated, her attention entirely consumed by the pages. James paused in the doorway, unsure of what to make of her. "Most people think I'm crazy for keeping physical books on a spaceship." Cara looked up at him, her eyes glinting. "Most people are fools." She replaced the book carefully, a gentle smile on her lips. "Knowledge should be treasured in all its forms." James leaned against the door frame, studying her. His instincts told him there was more to this woman than he had first realized. He'd been played, sure, but not in the way he'd first assumed. "You're not what you seem, are you?" James said, the words almost slipping out before he could stop himself. Cara turned to face him fully, her silver eyes catching the light of the ship. "You're right. I'm not what that merchant believed me to be." She closed the distance between them with a slow, purposeful stride, her movements fluid and graceful. Her voice dropped lower, almost teasing. "And what did he believe? That I was just another captured prize?" She moved closer, close enough that James could feel the heat of her violet skin. His heartbeat quickened, but he kept his cool, despite the electric charge in the air. Cara raised her hand, and a faint purple glow flickered at her fingertips. "My people possess certain abilities," she said softly, her eyes fixed on his, studying his every reaction. That merchant security systems didn't disable themselves by accident. The realization hit James like a plasma bolt. He suddenly understood. "You wanted to be sold," he said, the words feeling like a weight lifting off his chest. Cara's smile was all confidence now, no longer hiding any trace of submission. "I needed transportation off that station." "And you, James," she said, her silver eyes locking with his. "You have a reputation. A man of honor, in a profession not known for it, someone who would intervene if he saw a slave being sold. James couldn't help but be impressed. Her foresight was something else. She had carefully arranged this entire situation to get exactly what she wanted. He chuckled softly, a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You played me." She tilted her head slightly, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "I prefer to think of it as arranging an introduction." She stepped closer, her silver eyes sparkling with something much deeper now. "But I must admit, James, the reality has certainly exceeded my expectations." The iron spirit hummed steadily as it cut through the void of space, its quantum engines roaring quietly in the background. The vast expanse of the stars outside the cockpit's window was tranquil, an illusion of peace. Inside, however, things were far from calm. James couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation wasn't right. Every time he looked at Cara, something about her, her mysterious confidence, her calm demeanor, kept him on edge. She wasn't the terrified slave he had expected. She was far more. As he finished the pre-flight checks, his mind drifted back to their earlier conversation. She had promised to tell him who she really was once they were out of Trayer's prying eyes. James knew that trust was a fragile thing in their world. After all, he'd just been played. But this felt different. Her gaze, her calm, in the face of what should have been a terrifying predicament. Something was off, and James couldn't quite figure it out. The only thing he knew for sure was that his life, as he knew it, had just taken a massive turn. He made his way back into the main cabin. Cara was sitting cross-legged on the couch, a steaming mug in her hands, her silver eyes following the stars as the ship slipped into hyperspace. She had changed into one of his spare flight suits, something James had never expected to see on her. The plain black material looked effortlessly elegant on her, clinging to her form in a way that made his pulse quicken. Without looking up, she spoke softly, her voice lilting with amusement. "I hope you don't mind, but I found one of your suits. I must say it's far more practical than what I was wearing." James froze for a moment, caught off guard by the ease in which she had slipped into his world. He knew that suit, simple, efficient, yet comfortable for long trips. But the way Cara wore it, it felt almost like it was made for her. She had turned something so ordinary into something that exuded power. "It's fine," James said, forcing his gaze back to the controls. "It suits you." The moment felt awkward, yet there was something undeniably magnetic about her presence. Cara smirked and stood, crossing the room with the grace of a predator stalking its prey. "I needed to be comfortable. We have a long journey ahead." She approached the small bookshelf he'd maintained on the ship, rare Earth novels in paper format. He had once thought them a curiosity, something to pass the time. But now, as he watched her carefully turn the pages of the ancient novels, he realized she wasn't just curious. She was studying him. "You know," she said, her eyes meeting his, "most people are so caught up in digital archives they forget the value of a physical book." She paused, turning to face him, the corners of her lips twitching upward. "Knowledge should be treasured in all its forms." James raised an eyebrow. There it was again, her calm authority. The way she said it made it feel like she wasn't just talking about books, but about everything. The past, the present, and the future. It was a subtle reminder that she wasn't someone to be taken lightly. Cara gently replaced the book and walked toward him, her voice dropping to a softer, almost mysterious tone. "You're not like the others." James looked up from the console, intrigued. "The others?" "The others who treat me like a possession," she said, her silver eyes locking with his, piercing deep. I needed someone who wouldn't simply be bought, someone whose moral compass is unwavering, someone who doesn't look at a person like me and see just an object. The words stung, but James knew they were true. He'd seen it 1,000 times before, people who saw others as nothing more than tools to be used. But this woman was different. Before he could respond, she stepped closer, her fingers barely grazing the edge of his sleeve. A soft, purple glow flickered around her fingertips, the first time he'd seen her truly use her abilities outside of manipulating the ship's systems. "You wanted to be sold, didn't you?" James asked, his voice a low murmur. Cara smiled, a sly, knowing grin. "I did." It was all clicking into place. She wasn't a slave. She had orchestrated this entire situation. She had manipulated Treyer, and her appearance on his ship had been no accident. James exhaled slowly, stepping back slightly, trying to process everything that had just been revealed. "Why me?" "Because you're a man of honor, James," she replied softly. "A mercenary with a reputation for doing what's right. Even in this galaxy, where doing the right thing is rarely the easiest option." James's heart skipped a beat. He had always kept his personal code intact, despite the moral ambiguity of his profession. But to have someone like Cara, an Etherian princess, see that in him, to choose him for that very reason, was something entirely new. For the first time, James felt something he hadn't in a long time. Respect. And maybe, just maybe, a flicker of something deeper. But Cara wasn't done. She stepped closer, her voice becoming quieter, but no less commanding. "I need someone who can understand the bigger picture, James. My people believe that character reveals itself in small moments when no one is watching. I saw that in you." James's pulse raced. He could feel the weight of her words, her belief in him. He didn't know why, but suddenly he felt like the universe was shifting. Cara wasn't just some alien princess. She was an enigma, and he was about to unravel her. The hum of the Iron Spirit's engines was almost soothing, but James couldn't shake the tension gnawing at him. The stars outside the cockpit streaked into bright lines as they traveled through hyperspace, but something in his gut told him they weren't truly alone. His hand gripped the controls, but his mind was elsewhere. On Cara. Ever since she had stepped onto his ship, everything about his life had changed. She wasn't just a woman he had rescued from a black market transaction. She was an Etherian princess, a master manipulator with powers beyond his understanding. And yet, there was something undeniable about her presence, the connection they had forged over the course of their journey. Something about her made him question everything he knew about himself and his profession. "Something's wrong," James muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the sensor readings. Cara, sitting behind him in the co-pilot's seat, turned to face him, her silver eyes narrowing with concern. She had always been calm, confident, but now there was a faint edge to her voice as she asked, "What is it?" James didn't respond immediately, but the unease was palpable. He could feel it in his bones. They were being followed. "I'm not sure," he said after a beat, "but we're being tailed. Whoever it is, they're staying just out of sensor range, like they're waiting for something." Cara's face hardened as she studied the readouts. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly, sending a small pulse of purple energy to the ship's sensors, amplifying them, enhancing their accuracy. She shook her head. "This isn't random. Someone knew we were leaving. Someone knew exactly where to position themselves." James's instincts were usually spot on. His years of experience told him this wasn't a random pirate attack. This was deliberate. He studied the sensors again, locking in on the strange ship. "It's too coordinated to be pirates." She nodded, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "I'm glad you're catching on. The game's just begun. James looked at her, then back at the readouts. What do you think we should do? Cara stood, her movements fluid and graceful, like a predator sensing its prey. We're not running. Her voice was calm, but filled with a dangerous edge. It's time to show them what an Etherian princess can really do. Before he could respond, she was already moving, heading to the neural interface of the ship's quantum drive. She placed her hands lightly on the console, and a faint purple glow illuminated her fingertips as she began to work. What are you doing? James asked, his heart rate quickening as the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. Making a shadow, Cara replied, her voice low and commanding. A quantum shadow. We'll make it look like we dropped out of hyperspace, while we're actually continuing on a different vector. James's brow furrowed. That's impossible, you can't just… But before he could finish his sentence, the ship's systems began to shift. A low hum filled the cockpit as Cara's power coursed through the ship, linking with the quantum drive and creating a subtle distortion in space. The ship was now moving, but to the pursuing ships, it appeared they had disappeared. Her silver eyes glowed brighter now, her control over the ship's systems more intuitive, more natural. Now we wait. The ship's holographic displays flickered momentarily as they shifted to a new vector. The enemy ships were still closing in on them, but now they were flying straight into a trap. The quantum shadow they'd left behind would confuse their sensors, making them believe the ship had dropped out of hyperspace. But James knew better. This was no accident. Cara had set them up, drawing the pursuers in. They'll follow the shadow, thinking they've found us. We'll circle around and catch them from behind. James felt his pulse quicken. Despite the danger, the situation felt thrilling. He didn't know why, but Cara's confidence was infectious. It made him feel like they could take on the galaxy itself. You've done this before, haven't you? He asked, half joking, but with a genuine sense of admiration. Cara smiled, her lips curling into a playful grin. A princess must know how to handle difficult situations. Her voice was laced with mischief as she added, Though I must admit, the company makes this particular situation far more enjoyable. James couldn't suppress the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips. I'm sure it's a lot more fun for you than it is for me. Cara's eyes sparkled as she leaned closer to him, her voice a whisper. Don't be so sure, James. She paused, the air between them charged with something more than just the hum of the ship's systems. You're more than just a mercenary. James's heart skipped a beat as he met her gaze. He didn't know what to make of the way she was looking at him. Appreciative, but with a depth that hinted at something far beyond a mere partnership. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for. We have a few hours before we need to execute the next part of the plan, Cara continued, the playful tone never leaving her voice. She stepped closer, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the rest of the galaxy had faded away. James swallowed hard. Any suggestions on how to pass the time? Her lips curled into a predatory grin. I can think of a few activities worthy of a princess and her gallant rescuer. Before he could respond, the ship's proximity alert blared loudly, breaking the moment. He reluctantly pulled away from her, heading toward the controls with practiced ease. Saved by the bell. Cara's laughter, light and melodic, echoed in the cockpit. She stepped back, but the spark between them was still there, burning brightly. Let's show them they can't separate us. Her voice was filled with a renewed determination. The approaching enemy ships came into view, still unaware of the trap that had been set for them. James quickly reoriented the ship, preparing for the ambush. The calm of hyperspace was shattered by the sudden tension in the air. As the iron spirit sailed through the blackness of space, James and Cara found themselves preparing for something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. The enemy ships had been taken care of, disabled by the quantum resonance that had been amplified through their bond. Their pursuers were now floating aimlessly, confused and powerless. But that wasn't the end of their journey. Not by a long shot. Cara had already made it clear that her departure from the Etherian royal court wasn't just a simple flight to freedom. The royal guard, those who had followed her every move, were about to learn the truth. Cara had made her own choice. As James piloted the ship towards the Etherian capital, the royal palace loomed ahead, a glittering beacon in the vastness of space. The palace itself shimmered with crystalline walls, reflecting the starlight like a diamond in the night. It was beautiful, majestic, and full of secrets. And now, James was about to be introduced to those secrets in the most intense way possible. Cara sat across from him in the cockpit, her violet skin glowing softly under the pale light of the stars. Her silver eyes sparkled with an emotion James couldn't quite place. Determination, yes, but also something deeper. She had made a choice, and now she was ready to face her people. "Ready for this?" James asked, his voice laced with the tension he was feeling, even though he tried to keep his cool. Cara's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I've been preparing for this moment my whole life." James glanced over at her, surprised. "I thought you'd been running from your family this whole time." "Running?" She chuckled, her voice low and filled with confidence. "No, I've just been waiting for the right moment, the right person to stand by me." James's pulse quickened as he realized she was talking about him. A mercenary, not a prince, not royalty, but a man of honor who had seen through her ruse and stood by her when no one else had. Their ship entered the Etherian spaceport, and a soft chime echoed throughout the cabin. It was a call to action. Cara's expression shifted. Serious, focused, regal. She stood up, her movements graceful but filled with authority, as if she were already the queen of this domain. "Prepare yourself, James. The game's not over. It's just beginning." James nodded, though his mind was racing. He had no idea what to expect from this royal family. But he trusted Cara. There was no question about that now. They had been through too much together. And this was her fight. Not just his. The ship docked, and the airlock opened with a soft hiss. As they disembarked, royal guards flanked the station, their armor shining under the harsh lights of the palace. Royal banners fluttered in the breeze, but the moment Cara stepped foot onto the landing pad, every eye turned toward her. The royal court was about to see their lost princess again, but she was no longer the person they remembered. This wasn't a child, a prisoner, or a pawn in their political game. This was Cara, and she was no one's possession. A towering figure approached them, the royal commander, a hulking presence in silver armor, his face stern and unreadable. He was a man who had seen war and betrayal and had the scars to prove it. The moment his gaze fell on Cara, it was like the air around them shifted, heavy with the weight of history. "Your Highness," he said, his voice stiff, though there was an underlying tension in it that told James everything he needed to know. "Your father has been informed of your arrival. We will escort you to the royal hall immediately." Cara raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a sly smile. "No need for the formalities, Commander." She stepped closer, standing tall, her eyes piercing his. "I've made my decision. I'm not returning as a princess under your rule. I'm here as a woman who chose her path, and this time I choose my partner." The commander's jaw clenched at her words. He glanced at James, his gaze briefly flicking over the mercenary, who stood at Cara's side, unflinching. There was no mistaking it. James was no pawn either. "You're not in charge here, Commander," Cara continued, her voice steady. You'll do as I say. You'll respect my choices, or you'll regret it. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the commander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave a small nod, reluctantly acknowledging her authority. James, still stunned by the power in Cara's words, could only watch as she walked past the royal guards, her head held high, her every step radiating confidence. The royal hall was ahead, a vast, crystal-encrusted chamber filled with the elite of Etherian society. As Cara entered, every noble in the room fell silent. Eyes widened, whispers rippled, and glares from the more traditional factions flickered across the room. Cara didn't falter. She stood tall, her eyes scanning the crowd with a calculated calm. She was no longer the frightened woman James had first met. She was the heir to the Etherian throne, a woman who had seen through the lies, the deception, and had chosen her own path. The High Chancellor stepped forward, his voice low and formal. "Princess Cara," he began, his tone carrying the weight of generations. "You have returned, but you've broken the protocols. You've chosen an outsider, a human, a mercenary." Cara turned to face the Chancellor, her expression calm but filled with authority. "I've chosen James," she said simply, "and there's no going back." She raised her hand, and purple energy flickered around her fingers, reminding everyone of the power she possessed, of the quantum bond they shared. "I am quantum bound to him, and nothing will change that." The room fell silent, the tension unbearable. James stood there, at her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his blaster. But this wasn't a fight of guns and technology. It was a fight for their right to be together, for their freedom to live on their own terms. The grand Etherian royal hall was filled with silence. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as the noble families, once the proud rulers of the Etherian Empire, stared in disbelief at the woman standing before them. Cara, their lost princess, was not the obedient child they had once known. She was now a force of nature, a woman who had cast aside tradition and chose her own destiny, and more importantly, her own partner. James stood at her side, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blaster, his presence unwavering. He was no longer just a mercenary. He was a quantum-bound partner, a protector, and soon enough, a father. The royal court seemed divided. Some watched in awe, unable to hide the respect they were beginning to feel for Cara's courage. Others, especially the more traditional factions, seemed to seethe with outrage at the sight of a human standing among them, as if his very presence was a threat to their centuries of power. The High Chancellor, a dignified figure in ornate robes, finally broke the silence. His voice was formal, but there was a tremor in it now, the first sign of uncertainty. "Princess Cara," he began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. "You have chosen your path, and it is one of defiance. But know this: your union with this human will disrupt everything." Cara met his gaze with an unwavering stare. "I've already made my choice, Chancellor." Her voice was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who knew exactly who she was, what she wanted, and the power she held. James could feel the charge in the room, the deep power that Cara had just unleashed. It wasn't just her physical presence that was commanding attention. It was the quantum bond they shared. Their energy was now entwined, flowing in ways neither of them fully understood, but the galaxy would have to reckon with it. The Chancellor's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the cold undertone. "You risk your place, your people, your entire legacy with this human." Cara stepped forward, her violet skin glowing under the palace lights. Purple energy flickered at her fingertips, a silent demonstration of the power she controlled. You think I don't know what I'm risking? But my legacy will not be defined by old men in cloaks telling me how to live. Her voice rang out across the hall, and it was clear. This was her moment, and she was not backing down. Behind her, James felt the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket. She had made her choice, and so had he. He wasn't just standing beside her. He was standing for something far greater than either of them. The Royal Guard commander, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his armor gleaming as he addressed James. You, mercenary, stand in the presence of the royal court, yet you think you can walk away from this unscathed? James's eyes narrowed. He wasn't afraid of this man, this symbol of the old world, and neither was Cara. He was about to respond when Cara's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stands beside me, as an equal. Cara's words were sharp, deliberate. And in case you haven't noticed, Commander, the time for dominance and control is over. The galaxy is changing, and you're either with us or against us. Her words were so powerful, they carried across the room, settling over everyone. The Royal Guard commander hesitated, his jaw tight with anger and confusion. It was clear that Cara had already won this battle. The real question was whether the royal family would accept the shift in power, or if they would try to force her back into the mold they had set for her. One by one, the noble families began to murmur among themselves. The rift in the court was growing, some in favor of her new path, and others afraid of losing their grip on power. James glanced at Cara, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The energy between them pulsed with such intensity that he could almost feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a battle for a throne. It was a battle for their right to define their future together. Then, without warning, the doors of the royal hall flew open, and a small group of royal guards stormed in, their weapons raised. The tension escalated in an instant. "Seize them!" The command came from the shadows, from a figure in the back of the hall, his voice cold and dripping with venom. The High Chancellor's face twisted with shock as he realized what had just transpired. But before anyone could react, Cara's power erupted. A wave of purple energy rippled through the air, crashing into the guards and sending them stumbling backward. James, instinctively reaching for his weapon, watched as Cara moved through the chaos with unbelievable speed, her movements like a dancer's, graceful and deadly. The royal guards that had rushed in were completely overwhelmed. Cara wasn't just a princess, she was a force of nature, wielding the power of the Etherian throne in ways that no one had ever seen before. James stood by her side, his gun now aimed at the traitor who had given the order to attack. His finger tightened on the trigger, but Cara's hand gently rested on his arm, holding him back. "No, James. Let them see. Let them understand." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were full of fire. "They need to see who we really are." With a flick of her hand, she released another burst of energy, and the guards fell back, their weapons disabled. The room was silent now, save for the sound of labored breathing from the men who had dared to challenge them. Cara stood at the center of the hall, her energy crackling around her, her silver eyes scanning the room. "This is who I am, and I'm not going anywhere." The High Chancellor took a step back, visibly shaken. The power dynamic had shifted irreparably. The royal court could no longer ignore the quantum bond between Cara and James, and now it was clear that Cara had not just returned to the palace, she had returned to claim her place. The silence was broken by a voice from the crowd, one of the younger noble families, who had watched the scene unfold. "We stand with you, Your Highness." Cara turned to them, her lips curling into a smile. "Thank you." Together, we'll change this empire. We'll build something new, something stronger. James's heart swelled with pride. They were no longer just partners. They were a team. Together, they could face anything.